Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. And we are at the midway point, just past the midway point of the 2043 season. 46 and 36 record for our Buffalo Wings. We have been playing better as of late. You can see we're 7 games behind the Washington Nationals in the National League East, so that is not great. Washington does have the best record in baseball. We're up 3 on the final wild card spot, and you can see we're now ranked 3rd out of 32 teams in the latest power ranking. So although the division is going to be very difficult for us to get this year with just 80 games left, still feel like we're in a pretty good position to make a 16th consecutive playoff appearance. In theory, we should be 6 games better than the 46 wins that we have at 52 and 30, which would put us well on pace for a 100-win season and right in the mix for the division with the Nationals. But unfortunately for us, just because we're not living up to Pythagorean expectations doesn't mean that we'll completely close that gap over the rest of the season. But we were 17 and 10 in June after a relatively mediocre start to the season. We've split 4 games in July at this point. But overall, when I look at our team, I feel pretty content with it. We're 4th in the National League in runs scored. The issue is one that we've had in several recent seasons where we're just not hitting a ton of home runs. Only 10th in the National League, barely a home run a game at this point. So if there's a way to help that as we get closer to the trade deadline, we'll certainly think about it. And we're 1st in the National League in runs allowed, and you can see we're in the top handful of just about all of the pitching categories in the National League. So a very similar script to recent seasons, honestly a very similar script to most of the past decade. One of the top pitching staffs in baseball, supplemented by a good offense, and hopefully that will be enough for us to have some success. I mentioned we've got a little over 3 weeks until the trade deadline. Don't have a ton of capacity to do anything right now with just over $500,000 in money available. Do feel as if there are some potential options for us waiting down in AAA if we were to really need some help, though. Looking at our AAA roster, a couple of guys that I think could absolutely help us down the line. Danny Ferguson, who was our 1st-round pick a year ago, just promoted to AAA after a very strong stretch in AA over the first half of this season. He's conceivably in the mix to be a September call-up and to also potentially help us in the postseason. And then pitching-wise, Luis Palencia just finally came back from that long-term injury that cost him the last half of last season, the first half of this season. You can see he's now fragile in terms of his injury proneness. We're trying to pull up a scouting report on him because we don't really know exactly what he's going to look like coming back from the serious ruptured UCL. But he is a guy who, if he's close to what he's always been, certainly will be in the mix to be called up in September as well after he does some rehab, and could also certainly be in the mix to bolster our pitching staff down the line. Another guy, if we do need some help, would be our young closer, Mike Roberts, 7th-round pick from 2039, and he's been excellent in Albany for an extended period of time here. Just a brief cup of coffee in Buffalo a year ago when he was good. He's certainly in the mix to be a September call-up again, or if we have some injuries to the pitching staff. And could be in the mix for the postseason roster as well. So don't feel like we have to look too far for some help. And given the financial limitations we have, and the fact that there's not really any top talent available on the trade block at this point, we may have to go internally. Dylan Bond is probably the most interesting player out there to me. He's a competent defensive outfielder with 60 range and a good arm. And he's a pretty solid hitter. I don't love that he's fragile in terms of his injury proneness, but he is a guy who, over the course of his major league career, has put up a 121 WRC plus and is at 133 this year with Milwaukee. In the final year of his contract, making a ton of money, so we would need them to retain most, if not all, of that money to make this work. Also dependent on who we would send back in return. But he is in the mix of players that we have our eye on. Hopefully, someone else interesting might be added to the trade block in the coming weeks. And as we always say, we can trade for someone who's not on the trade block as well. I've looked into some higher end infielders and outfielders, and not surprisingly, the price is pretty prohibitive for players who might be a bit of a rental. One guy that we had looked at who could potentially help us if he was healthy is Roman Maples. You may remember him. We almost picked him second overall way back in 2027, over 16 years ago. Went with Ali Ostendorf instead, and Maples has had a very nice career as a shortstop for the Royals. But he's wrecked physically at this point. Going to be out for another 5 weeks with plantar fasciitis, but still think that bat and glove could certainly help our infield. The issue is that right now he's not willing to waive his no-trade clause. So as much as picking up a guy like him for the final couple months of the season is a asset that I think could certainly help us until he's willing to waive that no-trade clause, there's no point in doing it. And given that he's going to be out until August and he's wrecked physically, and he is in the final year of a very expensive contract, I don't know how much we'd really be willing to give up for him anyways. But we're going to keep an eye on him, check in again in a few weeks, and maybe he'll change his tack on the no-trade clause, given that he is an impending free agent. Kansas City at 46-36, though, does have the same record that we do and is first in the AL wild card, so probably out of loyalty to his team and loyalty to his organization, he's thinking that he can come back in early August and help them in the stretch run to perhaps win an AL West. So I think it's unlikely he'll end up waiving that NTC, since the Royals do appear to be right in the middle of it, but we'll certainly check in. And at the end of the last episode, we noted and we spent some time going through the career accomplishments of Deshaun Seifu, who is now over 3,000 hits in his career. Played one game since our last episode. Basically, we just wanted to get Palencia started on his rehab assignment and not forget about doing that, although I think the game wouldn't have let us move on anyways. So we've simmed ahead one day since the last episode. We have another couple hits for Seifu, who's now passed and broken the tie with Roberto Clemente. As we talked about, there's a lot of players he could conceivably pass over the remainder of this year. And it's conceivable that this could be his last year as a major leaguer. He's 39 years old now. Defensively, he's pretty inept at this point. His defensive ratings have really taken a hit over the last couple of seasons. And although he's still very fast, his hitting profile is starting to rapidly deteriorate as well, although he's kept the batting average at 275 this year. Over the last half decade or so, he's kind of settled into being a 270, 280 kind of hitter after being closer to a 300 hitter for most of the course of his career. Still has a 292 career batting average. Don't think that's going to change too much over whatever time he has left as a major leaguer. And with 1 week until the All-Star game, Ishmael Velasco, who was an All-Star as a rookie 2 years ago, was just named National League Player of the Week. 13 for 28 with 4 homers, 8 ribbies, and 10 runs scored. Don't know that Velasco is going to make the All-Star team this year, but another good, solid offensive season from him. As we talked about in the last episode, think it's unlikely that he's going to frequently put up the numbers that he did as a rookie, given his batting profile, but a good offensive player who's good defensively, popular with the fans, and durable is definitely a valuable asset for us in center field. And we just got our scouting report back on Palencia. Still has not pitched yet at Albany, but very high accuracy now, and he kind of looks similar to what he's always been. Low stamina, but a pretty interesting arsenal of pitching. He's a guy who could start or could relieve. We've got him on a pitch count now in Albany, coming off of the injury with his fragile injury proneness, and the first pitches he's thrown in a professional game in about a year at this point. But hopefully we can stretch him out as much as you can stretch out a guy with 40 stamina over the coming month or so, and then figure out when it's the right time to get him back in the major leagues, assuming he performs well in Albany, gets healthy, and kind of looks similar to the way we think he should. And as we get to the All-Star break, Juan Romero is asking for an extension, still looking for basically the same contract he's been looking for all season, 8 years at almost $20 million a year. Given that Romero is not having a great year, just a 107 WRC plus, 10 homers, 49 ribbies, and he's going to be 31 soon. I think we're probably looking at this as the fact that he opted into the qualifying offer last year as a positive. We're a win-now team. He's a captain personality and a guy who's led us in ribbies 4 straight years. I think he can help us win now. I just also am not convinced that despite the positive traits he has, including his Ironman injury proneness, that we want to make a long-term commitment to a player with his skill set at that kind of money. So might work out perfectly for us to have run things back with him one last time this year, and then we agree to head our separate ways in the off season. Not quite a Bill Belichick and Robert Kraft type of divorce with the New England Patriots. Haven't accomplished nearly as much with Juan Romero and the Buffalo Wings, but we do have that one World Series championship 2 years ago, and maybe time for us to go our separate ways after this year. And the All-Star game is coming up tomorrow, so the rosters have been announced yesterday. Haven't looked at them yet. I tend to think we're going to be pretty light on the All-Stars this year, despite our 51-38 record. I've automatically read all of these, but I haven't looked to know. But if I had to guess, I think Coma Duran in the outfield is probably in the mix. Despite the success of our pitching staff, not really sure who's going to make an all-star team for us. I would think Jim Lance might be a strong candidate. Before we look at that, we'll take a look at the standings here at the All-Star break. Still 7 games behind the Nationals, but we are up 4.5 now on the final wild card spot, which is positive. The Royals, who we mentioned, we might try to extract Roman Maples from them. They're 50-38. 4.5 up on the wild card in the American League. So think it's unlikely that he is going to all of a sudden decide to waive his no-trade clause. But we'll keep an eye on it. Still got almost 3 weeks until we need to make those kind of decisions. I guess Mike Whitehead, the second baseman who's hitting .324, also could certainly be in the mix to be an all-star this year with the great season that he's having. But I don't think there's going to be an abundance of Buffalo All-Stars this year. And taking a look, Barajas, that's nice to see. I wasn't sure whether he would make it or not. Kind of a lifetime achievement award at this point for Alexis Barajas. Named an All-Star again this year, despite bit of an off season by his standards. 5-5 record with a 3.58 ERA, 2.1 WAR on the season. Our ace has been a big time pitcher for us for around a decade now. He's an Iron Man as far as his injury proneness. Still signed for $20 million next year before a player option for the final year of that big contract, 8 years, $168 million that we gave him quite some time ago. But nice to see Mr. Barajas named an All-Star for the 8th time in his career. He was a Cy Young Award winner once 7 years ago, and he's among a handful of players who have been a member of all 3 of our championship squads. So nice to see Seifu named to the All-Star team. Jim Lance did not end up making it, and we did not have any relievers make the team either. Doesn't look like, even with that 324 average, that Whitehead was named a second baseman All-Star. As I kind of thought might be the case, Coma Duran is named to the All-Star team as an outfielder, second consecutive year, or third consecutive year. Wow, he's been an All-Star 3 straight years now. So he's been a productive offensive player for us. 293, 18 homers, 57 ribbies, a 145 WRC plus. He's been a very important player since we picked him up in a trade with the Giants just a little over 3 years ago at this point. And it looks like that's it. So 2 All-Stars. I was kind of thinking it would be Coma Duran and a starting pitcher. But the starting pitcher I thought it might be was wrong. So Barajas and Coma Duran are only All-Stars. I mentioned that I thought Lance at an 8-4 record, 3.06 ERA, and 99 strikeouts might get the nod, but went with the veteran Alexis Barajas instead. And as we move towards about a week until the trade deadline, still playing fine, 54-41 record. We are 8.5 behind the Nationals at this point, 4 up on the final wild card spot. So similar position to where we've been, a little further behind in the division, but not really concerned that we aren't going to make the playoffs. Take a look at the team statistics, and we're still 4th in the National League in runs scored, still 10th in homers, still 1st in runs allowed, still a good defensive team, still stealing a lot of bases, and we're still 6 off of Pythagorean expectations. The 10-19 record in one-run games, I think, is a big chunk of that underperformance. 10-7 record here in July, so with the 588 winning percentage in July, a little better than our season mark of 568. So feel like we don't necessarily have to make a huge move, but would still like to do everything possible to try to make a run at another title. Our scouts did just recommend that perhaps we visit Max Clark. You may remember him. He's a guy who's had an excellent career. And back in 2038, we made a trade for him that we hoped would help push us over when we were a competitive team trying to win. In 2038, it would have been a 3rd World Series title in 5 years, which we came up short with. But he hit 295 for us with 7 homers and 35 ribbies and less than 200 at-bats. Put up a 146 WRC plus, and you can see he is still a very effective offensive player. He is wrecked as far as his injury proneness, which is a little scary, but still an offensive force in general, particularly against right-handed pitching. So in the final year of his deal, and I think he's a guy who could certainly help us. St. Louis at 45-50 is really not in the mix for the playoffs. I don't know if he's been added to the trade block or not. We'll take a look at that, but certainly someone to investigate. The Royals still only 2.5 back in the AL West, so I'm guessing that probably means that Maples is still unwilling to waive his no-trade clause. Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's going to be an opportunity to make a play on him, which he would be a real nice asset to bring on for a couple of months in a postseason run, but not unexpectedly, it doesn't seem like we will ever be able to unite with Roman Maples. I won't say reunite because he was never actually a member of our organization, although we did strongly consider him at number 2 overall before we went, as we often do, with the pitcher instead. And it does look like Max Clark has been added to the trade block. So I think between him and Dylan Bond, there's certainly an opportunity for us to add a veteran bat. Clark would be a lefty, Bond would be a righty. The concern is that Clark is wrecked physically in 38. Bond is fragile physically in 34. So the goal would not be so much to hope that they help us close the large 8.5 game gap on the Nationals, but more to keep on the course as far as how we're playing in the regular season. Hope that we could play them sparingly enough to keep them healthy for the playoffs, and then hopefully have either a Clark or a Bond completely healthy. And I don't know about dominant, but certainly someone that could contribute significantly for us in the playoffs. A couple of other familiar names available. Spencer Nivens is a guy that we've looked at on the trade market and in free agency on occasion over the past decade. Things never really lined up with him. Looks like he would consider a trade to us at this point. Oftentimes he had a no trade clause. Don't know that at 41 and fragile physically, he's any better than a Max Clark or a Dylan Bond. And I think profile wise, he's probably not quite the same hitter as those players at this point. But he's in the mix also. And then familiar names, our old catcher, Andres Medina. Love the glove, hitting .256 with 12 homers, but he's in AAA Nashville this year. So for a guy who's making almost $14 million, I guess the Rangers have retained his whole salary. So it's not Nashville's a major league team now, the Nashville Stars. What am I saying? I was like, that's weird that he's in AAA, but he's not in AAA. The whole point of this playthrough is that Nashville and Buffalo came in at the same time. So he's having a, typical Andres Medina year, 103 WRC plus, good defense, but it looks like Nashville is willing to move on from him. Tim Hull, another familiar name, longtime utility infielder for us after a fair amount of time as our starting shortstop, hitting just a .184 with the Mets. Like his glove and his versatility, but offensively don't think he's going to really give us much of anything that we don't already have with the infielders we have. Tim Gaglia and Arturo Flores, a couple of our other former players also on the trade block. The one who might be interesting is Toby Golston, a 28-year-old shortstop, also in the Stars organization. So the Stars look like they are just dumping contracts. He's in the last year of his deal, headed to free agency. Really good defensive player and a decent bat. It's got some pop. Another guy who's fragile as far as his injury proneness. Having a brutal year this year with Nashville, hitting just a .169, 53 WRC plus. But over the course of his major league career, he's been a close to league average offensive player. And he does, as we talked about, provide a little home run pop in his bat for a middle infielder. And he's also good defensively. So not necessarily the greatest influence in the clubhouse, but I'm going to certainly investigate some of these guys in the last years of their contract. Golston, Nivens, Clark, and Bond. I don't know that I would mortgage the farm for any of them. Not that I actually have a farm to mortgage. But it is also kind of interesting that our fan interest for the first time in years has just dipped below 100. So perhaps making a big trade to bring on an important player could be a way to re-engage the fans in Buffalo who are very used to us being in first place and spoiled by that, and perhaps a little less enthusiastic this year now that we're in second place and only fighting for a wild card. Again, not a ton of money to bring on players. We could, take down scouting or player development to make it work, and likely would if there was a guy who could do that. Not huge holes, but if we could add a left fielder that we feel better about than Porter or Romero, would certainly do that. Honestly, if we had to send Romero back, we're not going to sign him anyways, and we've already done the qualifying offer exercise with him, so I don't think there's any compensation coming our way when he moves on at this point. So It's possible we could include him. Possible we could include a Josh Porter. Canales is out of option years, so I don't think we would send him to AAA. There's levers to press. The middle infielders, Contreras, Whitehead, Andrus, and even the third baseman, Medina, I think they all have options. So if we needed to, we could send one of them down for a month to open up a roster spot for either an infielder or an outfielder, depending on which direction we wanted to go. So I'm going to do some investigating of what the prices look like for these people. I don't think I'm willing to give up a bunch of prospects for a rental of any of these players for a couple of months. I think incrementally they all could help us, but I don't necessarily think that any of them are really difference makers. Golston is probably the closest just because he does give us some home run pop from positions where we haven't gotten much, and he's also a pretty good defensive player. I tend to think he's probably going to be the most expensive of these guys since he's much younger than the rest of them, and he does bring that really good infield defense. But maybe the fact that he's selfish and he's got some negative personality traits will pull his price down a bit. And the price for Golston is definitely high. Now, granted, we need Nashville to retain a big chunk of his contract, 90% in this case, to make anything work. But if they retain 90% of his contract, they would want Jim Lance in return, and definitely not willing to do that. I think just for purposes of exploring things, I'm going to cut our scouting and development budgets down a little bit temporarily right now just to open up some money so we can get a more fulsome look at what the options might be if we were willing to take on a little bit more of the contracts of some of these people that we're looking at. And not surprisingly, the price for Golston remains high, even if they're only going to retain 10% of his contract. Lance is the only guy in our organization who gets the deal done right now. I'm going to play around with some things because given that we do have Ferguson on the way up as a middle infielder, we could theoretically include a Whitehead, a Contreras, an Andrus, one of them in the deal to kind of remove the logjam of good fielders who are pretty versatile defensively but have very average major league bats that we have in the middle infield right now. I don't know that any of them are going to have any extreme value to make this deal easier to get done, but we'll at least investigate it. And Alejandro Contreras had very limited value. They still wanted Lance in addition to him. Mike Whitehead gave us a couple more options when we included him. But our starting shortstop, Jim Andrus, has some decent value. Still need to include a pretty good player along with him to get the deal done. So I don't know that we're going to do it for a rental. Golston is a very good defensive shortstop. But Jim Andrus is a good defensive shortstop. Jim Andrus more positive in the clubhouse than Golston. Certainly not the same kind of bat as Golston. The 28-year-old, 112 career homers and a 93 career WRC plus. Andrus, on the other hand, 32 career homers and an 84 WRC plus. The 32 career homers, clearly not an apples-to-apples comparison because he only has 1,400 major league at-bats, but he's not the same type of offensive player as Golston is, but he's similar defensively. Andrus, not as good an error rating, but a bit better arm than Golston has. And I just can't see myself to rent Golston for 2 months, giving up on Andrus. Because Andrus we can potentially have back for around $3.5 million next year to continue playing short for us, whereas Golston will be headed right to free agency. And as I mentioned, we have to throw someone else in the trade also. The person I almost certainly would do would be Brad Wilson, a double-A pitcher for us. He's the 29-year-old. He's the one who most easily gets this deal done. If potentially Golston was at a similar point in his career as Andrus and heading into his arbitration years, I'd think about it. If Golston was, just signed to a somewhat reasonable contract for the next few years, I would think about it too. But as a guy who's headed to free agency, despite the fact that he would upgrade our offense a little bit, this price is it's not a little prohibitive. It's either prohibitive or it's not, and the price is prohibitive to me. So I don't think we're going to head down that path. And I think we're going to pass on Golston. We can get Nashville to keep about half of his contract for this year. We'd have to include Whitehead, who, as we talked about, was having a great year, hitting .328, but not as good defensively, and certainly when you look at his batting profile, not as good offensively. I don't think, although to be fair, Whitehead does have a 95 WRC plus for his career, driven by the big year that he's having this year. But I think that would certainly upgrade us for this season in our push for the title if we swapped Golston for Whitehead. The issue is we also have to include Solano Toselli, the number 66 prospect in baseball, 3-3 with a 4.56 ERA in Utica this year before he suffered a torn rotator cuff. So he's likely out till next year, but still a pretty highly regarded prospect. Along with Pat Carman, who was our first-round pick back in 2040. He is probably about to get promoted up to A-ball in the coming weeks once the rookie ball seasons end. Not a top-line prospect at this point, but still certainly looks like someone who could be useful at the major league level. So a middle infielder under control for another 4 or so seasons, plus 2 solid starting pitching prospects for a 2-month rental of a player who's a small upgrade seems a little too much to spend to me. If any of you feel otherwise, please let me know in the comments, and I'm sure you will if you feel strongly that we should have done this deal. I like Golston. Like I said, the glove is interesting, and that home run power from a middle infielder is definitely an attractive and unique feature compared to the rest of our team. But he's not great in the clubhouse. He's fragile physically, and he's just going to cost an awful lot in terms of the resources we'd have to give for a 2-month rental. Now, we could look to extend him to a contract. We're planning on moving on, or thinking we're likely to move on from Romero this offseason, so that's some money that we won't be spending next year. But to me, the price is just a little bit too high, given that despite my perusing of the trade market, we still have one of the best offenses in the National League. It just doesn't hit a ton of home runs, which admittedly at times has cost us, particularly in the postseason in recent years. But I just don't know that Golston is enough of a difference maker as far as the home runs. I mean, you look at his 162 game average, though, and it is 35 home runs and 101 ribbies. So, he's so fragile that he's really, not played a ton of complete seasons at the major league level at this point. But he's a pretty useful bat when he's out there. But it is also a bit odd that, okay, those 162 games, those numbers didn't make sense for me. I was looking at his entire career, including his minor league levels. And when we look at his 162 game average as a major leaguer, it's 26 home runs to go with that 221 average and that 93 WRC plus. So I was trying to figure out how the numbers were that incredible, but it's really because it was including some monster minor league seasons in those 162 game averages, because I was not careful about the league scope that I was looking at. But we have addressed that now. So I don't think he's the guy. Even with the pop, he's been a below average offensive player over the course of his major league career. I just think it's too expensive. And I don't think we're going to be able to get a trade done for Max Clark either. The price for him is not as high as Golston, but it's still a lot for what he is, which is a 2-month rental of a wrecked 38-year-old. I really like what Clark can do, particularly against right-handed pitching. But again, for a 2-month rental of a guy in his late 30s who's wrecked, that we can't guarantee is going to be available when we really need him in the playoffs, the price to me is just too expensive. Keep in mind, we still do have Bobby Bolig down in AAA. Now, Bolig is not the same type of offensive force that Max Clark is, but he's a little bit younger. He's a little bit less injury prone. He's got better speed. He's not as good defensively. He's not as good a hitter. But if we needed a left-handed bat for September and possibly for the playoffs, we kind of have that in the organization with Bolig for free at this point. So I don't think Clark is the way to go either. And we do have a deal together for Dylan Bond, who admittedly was our third choice among those three players. Also fragile physically, competent defensively, popular with the fans, and as we talked about earlier, guy with a 122 WRC plus over the course of his career. He is particularly effective against left-handed pitching. That's an area where we've got a .550 winning percentage this year, so we've been a little bit less effective against left-handed pitching than right-handed pitching. So the thought is we bring Bond on board as a rental to give us a little more pop against left-handed pitching, and we don't have to give up a ton to do it and to get them to keep his entire contract. Two guys don't hurt us at all. The relief pitcher, Juan Silva, out of the DSL team, is a good leader, and that's about all I can say nice about him. Sergio Tristan on the DSL team is competent defensively, but has some negative personality traits. But we do have to give up David Partita. He was a 5th-round pick of ours a year ago, has not impressed in rookie ball to date, but does have a profile that suggests he could be an effective back end of the rotation type of starter in 4 or 5 years. Don't see him being a real difference maker, but a right-handed arm out of the bullpen, or like I said, a 5th starter, maybe a 4th starter if everything worked out perfectly. Don't see him being a huge part of our future, and to be able to bring on a bat like Dylan Bond, who I think we should be able to keep healthy, playing him only against left-handed pitching, is a guy who can certainly help our offense as a pinch hitter off the bench and then a regular player against lefties, as I mentioned. And perhaps when we get into the playoffs, if Porter and or Romero haven't really turned things around, and I did have the opportunity to trade those guys, but I didn't love the returns. We could have used one of them in a Bond trade, but I still look at their profiles and what they've done over the course of their careers and hope for some positive regression towards the mean from both of them over the last couple of months of the season. So I wanted to keep the two of those guys around. But back to the point that I interrupted myself in making, if it doesn't work out with Romero and or Porter, could envision a scenario where by the time we get to the playoffs, there's kind of a Dylan Bond / Bobby Bolig platoon of veteran outfielders who are pretty accomplished in their mid-30s, who give us, in the case of Bond, a good bat against lefties, and in the case of Bolig, a good bat against righties. So not the most exciting trade deadline, but we are going to go ahead and complete that deal. Fans very excited that Bond is on board. Now that is going to necessitate a difficult roster decision for us, and it's going to in a way, weaken our team over the coming 5 weeks or so until we get to September call-ups. But positively, fan interest now at 100 or higher. And I think what we're going to do is send Mr. Contreras back down to AAA. He's gotten the batting average up to 220, but he's not as good right now in terms of his production as Whitehead or Andrus or Medina. Now, that will mean that Seifu is going to be a utility infielder for us when those guys need time off for the next 5 weeks, which is not ideal. Seifu has primarily been our DH this year. Looking at his fielding stats, you can see he's played briefly at first and second and occasionally at third, and he's not been particularly good defensively, as you would expect at any of those positions. So instead of having a platoon of Whitehead and Contreras at second base, which gives us a pretty competent middle infielder to back up at third, short, and second, Seifu going to be getting some more action in the field at this point, but didn't make sense to me to send down any of our outfielders. And in some cases, in most cases actually, there were no options available to even do that. And we'll weaken our infield defense a bit for the next 5 weeks with the thought that when we do ultimately get to September, we'll have 30 guys on the roster. And then when we do get to the playoffs with all the off days, we're going to have only 12 pitchers and 14 position players. So that put us in a position where either a Contreras or a Ferguson, if he happens to develop in AAA, will likely be on the roster with the likes of Whitehead, Medina, and Andrus and Seifu, giving us plenty of defensive and positional flexibility when we get to October. And just a handful of days now until the trade deadline. Have not been playing as well. 4-6 in our last 10, and you can see we've slipped to third in the NL East, 11 games behind the Nationals, half a game behind the second place Expos. Still up 4 on the last wild card spot, so not feeling that we necessarily need to panic and pay up for any of those other guys that we had talked about, but still we'll investigate them a bit more over the next couple of days. If the price is more reasonable, maybe we do something else, but I think it's somewhat unlikely that there's going to be another move coming. And Max Clark has been traded to the Guardians, so he's no longer an option for us. They traded him along with a relatively useless reliever, David Orantes, but they got some interesting stuff in return, so I don't think it was an offer that we would have matched. They got the first base prospect, Pete Ruskin. You can see, I think, his pretty high potential. Good combination of contact, home run power, and eye potentially for a switch hitter. So he's been pretty productive this year with a 124 WRC plus in rookie ball. Would think that he'll be promoted relatively quickly. And then Bobby Yates, a decent-looking 24-year-old reliever, and then a couple lesser prospects in Owen, Vergen, and Danny Gordon, who's, I guess, marginally interesting. So I don't think we were going to give up. I know we weren't going to give up a prospect similar to Ruskin. It seems like with the 2 pitchers that they wanted from us, the price, I'd say, was maybe a little higher for us than it was for Cleveland, but don't feel bad on missing out on Clark. The price was just not one that we would have been willing to pay. And we did also check back in on the shortstop, Toby Golston, with Nashville, and the price for him was honestly a little more than it was before, which for a 51-51 team, I guess they're only 2 games out of the wild card, so I guess that's why they're expecting a king's ransom for him, but just did not seem like anywhere near a reasonable amount for a 2-month rental at this point. I don't think Maples is going to be amenable with the Royals just being 2.5 games out. but we'll check in. And he's still not willing to waive his no trade clause. So I think we've kind of done what we're going to do. I don't feel great that we're 12 games out in third place. We're still 3.5 up on the final wild card now. And to be fair, there's also a 4-game back to the next team. So feel pretty confident that we're going to be in the playoffs. Think it's very unlikely that we will be able to catch the Nationals, who continue to play by far the best record in baseball. That 69-34 record is 8 games better than the Padres, who have the second best record in baseball. So excellent season for the Nationals. Taking a look at the leaderboards here shortly before the end of July. Mike Whitehead hitting .315, still third in the National League, and we still don't have anybody else among the top 3 in the primary offensive categories. And we've now made it to August 1st, another bad loss to finish off the month of July, 13 games back in the National League East as we head into the final 2 months of the season, up 3 on the Dodgers for the final wild card spot, and again, Phillies 4.5 behind that. So we've got a 7.5 game lead potentially as far as making the playoffs. So pretty confident we will be back in the postseason for a 16th consecutive time. Also pretty confident that Deshaun Seifu will not be leading the National League in steals for his 16th consecutive time. 27 out of 35 this year. Does have the batting average up to .294 and a 107 WRC+. So despite the fact that we see in front of our eyes our scouts' rankings on him declining rapidly over the last couple of years, Seifu is a KG veteran, and he knows how to produce, and having a pretty solid year for a 39-year-old at this point. He will be playing a little more in the field over the next month until we bring up Ferguson and or bring back Contreras. He's an Iron Man as far as his injury proneness, so despite his age, that does not concern me at all. So feeling okay about the team at this point. Hopefully the trade that we made will pay dividends down the line. Feel like the price was very reasonable. Very small sample size for Dylan Bond, but 1 for 10 with a run scored in a ribby. Would expect him to improve those numbers in the coming weeks. Take a quick look at how the month of July ended up for us, and it ended up being a 500 month after we got off to a solid start. We've definitely struggled over the last couple of weeks. 6th in the National League in runs scored at this point, 2nd in the National League in runs allowed. So with the poor performance over the last few weeks, we've slipped 1 notch in both of those categories. Overall, though, our pitching staff is still very good, and overall our offense is still good. And at 56-46, we're 6 games behind Pythagorean expectations, 10-20 in 1-run games now. So certainly an argument to be made that we've gotten somewhat unlucky so far. And the hope is that turns over the final couple months of the season. We'll find out what happens in our next episode. Looking forward to some interesting decisions as far as our September call-ups, which will ultimately, hopefully, also feed into some interesting decisions as far as our playoff roster as well. And we'll find out the answers to those questions and whether we do make a 16th consecutive playoff appearance in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.